Yeah, so I think that in order for change to happen, it's there's going to be a lot of different there's a lot of different things that have to be tackled. It's not just one thing. I think it's revolved around the Black community, but there's many different things that need to be tackled. For instance, the wage gap. But why is there a wage gap? Well, obviously there's individual racism, right? There's definitely that. And people, I think there's a lot more, I don't know, don't quote me on this. I think the statistics show that there's a lot more white CEOs. And it's so normal for someone to treat someone who's more like them with favor. And as a result, there could be a wage gap. There's wage gaps between the different races. So, but also, that's not the only problem. Why is there also a wage gap? Because the lack of education. But why is there a lack of education too? Because of geographical displacement. That is a result from history. Because from slavery to even the Jim Crow laws, basically it kind of placed the African Americans in close proximities and in areas where there's less opportunities, it's more impoverished, less health care, all these things. And basically what happens? They have a lot less opportunities, disadvantages, more health problems, more violence, less education.
It's a feedback loop. It's a feedback loop.
Absolutely.
Right.
And as you got to tackle that.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, it's way more complicated than just racism. It's like racism has a part to play, but it's just a myriad of other different factors in society that just feeds off of each other and creates this net, this trap that is very hard to break out of. And that kind of reflects the conversation that needs to be had. It's not just one conversation. And that's part of my, I've been thinking about this for quite some time, and I don't claim to be right and correct in what I think, but the way I see it, there are three conversations that are being had in this whole protest and this whole case. One being, first of all, there's a conversation about racism, and that's going everywhere. Like we can see that it's racism, not just in government, but in every level of society, individual to the collective. And that's a conversation that needs to be had, and I'm glad we're having it. But then there's the other conversation, separate conversation about police brutality.
Yes.
Right. And that itself is a whole other problem because police brutality is not just on African Americans. You have brutality and killings of other white people, Hispanics, Latinos, and Asians.
Oh.
Like it's everyone. Not just, even though, and I did some research on how people are talking about the likelihood of a Black person being killed by a white police officer. And I personally am not satisfied with a lot of their metrics. Like, for example, they gave statistics on the number of people being killed by a police officer organized by race. And just that metric of being killed by a police officer or being brutalized by an officer, to me, that's not an adequate metric, because I'm pretty sure that there are instances where police brutality may be justified. And I think a better metric would be giving a chart where we see the number of people who have been brutalized by the police unjustly. And I think that would be a better reflection of this, the state things are in. And if I don't know if there's that chart, if people find a chart like that, they can just put it down in the comments.
That's an excellent point. It's a great
yeah,
point.
But I would love to see a chart like that. And if in that chart we still see the African American community being the top at the targeted people, then that's a big problem. That's a big problem. But but as I was saying, some of the metrics that are being used, I'm not entirely satisfied with. I'm not saying that there's not a problem. There is. It's just I would like to see it more clearly. So there's that issue, and people are having that issue. Like people are pushing for more restrictions, restricting policies to be implemented in the police department. Like the whole debate on chokeholds and the use of force, things like that. I think those are great and that they are necessary, but they are only addressing the issue of police brutality in general. So we have the conversation of racism in every sector of society. We have the conversation of police brutality in general, regardless of race. But then we also have the conversation in the middle, where we talk about police brutality or the police department's relationship with the African American community. It's like a Venn diagram, right? You have this, you have that, and then you have the overlapping part. And that's a whole other conversation in itself. And part of the frustrating thing as I look through the news and what people are saying on social media, it's just really confusing because I see everyone trying to have all three conversations at the same time without distinguishing between the three. So you can have a conversation between three people. One person will be talking about racism, the other talking about police brutality, and then another person talking about the police and the Black community and their relationship to each other. And I think when they try to do that, it's just a mess and there's not a lot of progress forward because those are very difficult conversations by themselves and you can't have them at the same time without having the understanding of how it's laid out, right? Do you see it that way?
Well, I was wondering, can you, for the video, mention those three different conversations again that are taking place but are very uncomfortable?
Okay, yeah. So again, number one, there's the conversation of racism in general, in like whether it's the top of society, like the government, or the bottom of the pyramid in everyday neighborhoods. Like racism exists everywhere. So that's that conversation. And it's something that everyone on social media has been talking about, which is great. We need that conversation. And then we have another conversation about police brutality, regardless of race, because we see that we see a lot of white victims as well, Hispanic victims as well. And that is also intertwined with what you talked about the web of societal issues that feed off of one another. And that's part of it. And here's the thing, not all police brutality is racism at its core, because there are also issues within the police department and how officers are being promoted, what are their metrics of success, how they're being trained, how much they're being paid, and all these different issues play into how police officers are carrying out their duties in public. So even though racism is a deadly factor in the police department, I don't think it's the only thing. the only cause for police brutality. So that's its whole issue by itself. There's racism and there's police brutality. And then we have this overlapping section where we have police violence that has racism at its core. And that seems to be, specifically for the case of George Floyd, that seems to be the case. But we're having all these three separate conversations that is very hard to, it's very hard to split them, because one person can be talking about racism in general, and then another person talking about racism specifically for one community with the police. And I think if you want to go far, if you want to progress far in our conversations, we need to be able to decipher what exactly we are talking about and work towards those goals.